Junji Ito is best known for his grotesque horror stories. Most people read these and simply take them at face value. Amazing horror stories filled to the brim with shock and gore. But would you believe me if I told you that many of these stories have subtext critiquing Japanese culture? That's right. A lot of Junji Ito's stories actually address social issues in Japan. Today, I will be looking at some of these stories and talking about how Junji Ito uses horror to subvert and criticize Japanese culture, as well as give some background on these cultural topics. Familial pressure. I'm sure we have all felt it at one point in our life. The pressure to please your family, the pressure to get married and have kids, the pressure of meeting your significant other's family, so on and so forth. Of course, this issue is often felt heavily in Japan. Japan has the stereotype of parents putting immense pressure not only on their children, but also their in-law children. Despite being a stereotype, this is not completely unfounded. The story, My Dear Ancestors, addresses these pressures directly. In this story, Shuichi Makita brings his girlfriend Risa home to meet his dad. Risa had previously went to Shuichi's house to meet his father, but suffered some sort of trauma and lost all her memory. Risa later finds out why she lost her memory when she discovers that Shuichi's dad is attached to a worm-like being composed of the skulls and brains of his family's ancestors. This hive mind is obsessed with keeping the family line going, and when the host of the family parasite dies, their skull joins the line and attaches itself to the next youngest member of the family. Shuichi's father dies, and Shuichi becomes attached to the ancestor line. It commands him to impregnate Risa in order to continue the family line, and it's implied that he does, as Risa loses her memory again while stuck in Shuichi's house. My Dear Ancestors is clearly a metaphor for how intense familial pressure affects both the children and their spouses. For Risa, meeting Shuichi's father is an extremely stressful event, not to mention the fact that he is a giant centipede-like being. Risa is being forced to accept Shuichi's family lineage, no matter how horrifying it is. This pressure does not just affect Risa though. Shuichi is also a victim of his family's pressure. His family constantly bugs him about getting married and having children, and thus, it becomes his one goal in life. Shuichi is absolutely obsessed with pleasing his ancestors, as shown by his mental break near the end of the story, as he both literally and metaphorically has to bear the weight of his entire family lineage. Overall, Junji Ito uses this story to show just how scary a family's pressure on their children can be. In Japanese cities, privacy is one of the most valued things. From wearing face masks, to having black book covers to make sure no one can see what you are reading, privacy is not just a luxury, it's a right. With cities slowly encroaching on rural areas and taking over Japan, we can see something interesting happening. While privacy is still preserved, at the same time it is constantly being violated. A story that tackles this oxymoronic relationship with privacy in Japan is Town Without Streets. This story follows Saiko, a student who runs away from home to escape her family's increasingly prying eyes. She ends up in a mysterious town where everyone lives in one gigantic building. Here, privacy is of utmost importance. Everyone wears a mask to keep themselves anonymous, despite constantly violating everyone else's privacy. And at the same time, there is also a thriving community of voyeurs who watch people's every move. This town mirrors the experience of large cities in Japan. Due to the sheer number of people, you are pretty much anonymous any time you are in a major urban square. This anonymity is valued, and people will go to extreme lengths to keep it that way, yet at the same time, anonymity is stripped away in the workplace. Gossip is extremely common, and for any missed time, for example due to bereavement, you must inform all of your coworkers about the loss, sparing no details. With the encroaching of large cities on rural areas, privacy is slowly stripped away, symbolized in the story by Saiko's parents spying on her more and more. Saiko's aunt represents the constant struggle for anonymity. People may put on masks in public, but that still does not give you any more privacy than you have already had. In order to cope with this reality, Saiko's aunt has abandoned all concepts of privacy, since she has realized that there really is no point fighting for her privacy. Remember, no matter how big the city is, you are never anonymous. One of Junji Ito's most popular long-form works is Gyo. It tells the story of Tokyo getting attacked by various sea life, all with mechanical metal legs. The story soon evolves into a body horror hell, as the machines that were once carrying fish now begin to carry humans. It is then revealed that these strange machines are actually Japanese biological weapons from World War II that run on bacteria. Biological warfare is nothing new to Japan, although they may not like to admit it. The plot of Gyo can be seen as a reference to Japan's biological warfare experiments in World War II. Unit 731 was a Japanese military R&D unit in World War II, responsible for performing biological experiments on prisoners of war and civilians in China. These horrific experiments often involved vivisection, intentionally infecting people with fatal diseases, and testing biological weapons on villages and cities. The scientists behind these experiments were later given immunity by the US government. Unit 731 is not very well known in Japan, as Japan has a history of not mentioning war crimes. Gyo can be clearly read as a criticism of this attitude in history. The similarities between Unit 731 and Gyo are unignorable. In fact, the character of Dr. Koyanagi's father is even hinted to be a member of Unit 731. The fish weapons in Gyo were covered up and destroyed by the enemy, but eventually, the fish come back worse than ever and attack Japan. This can be seen as Japan's history of war crimes coming back to the surface to cause even more harm than they already have. Because of this, in Gyo, innocent people like Tadashi now have to take responsibility in dealing with the crimes of their forefathers. There's a common saying in Japan: the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. This is a metaphor for how Japan is a conformist society. This conformist society also manages to create quite a few individualistic movements. These can be seen in Japan's various fashion subcultures. Now, what does any of this have to do with Junji Ito? One of his most famous stories actually addresses this issue: the Enigma of Amigara Fault. After an earthquake, a fault appears on Amigara Mountain. In the walls of this fault are various human-shaped holes. The people investigating the fault begin to feel an urge to enter these holes. One by one, people succumb to the mountain's influence and enter the holes as they believe specific holes were made for them. It might be a bit of a stretch, but I believe this story is about becoming obsessed with one's individuality within a conformist society. I mainly get this idea from the way the characters talk about the holes within Amigara Mountain. I believe these holes represent one's individuality. Those who succumb to the influence of the holes always rant about how it was meant for them, as though to say they have found what makes them special in society: their likes, their tastes, their talents, etc. To accept the whole is to accept your individuality, and this is what makes them so alluring. No matter how conformist you may think you are, you cannot ignore the fact that you are an individual. This is what the holes make the characters realize. Once they find their whole, or their individuality, they can no longer ignore who they are, no matter what. They must accept it and enter their whole, leading them to their doom. With Japan having quite the high depression and suicide rate, it's not a surprise that loneliness is a big issue in Japan. After all, this is the country that is recognized for the famous terms neat and lonely death. Now, of course, knowing what this video is, there is going to be a Junji Ito story that addresses this issue. This story is the infamous Army of One. In fact, the main character of Army of One, Michio, is a NEET. His status as a NEET is actually what helps him survive this story. Now, what exactly is a NEET? NEET is an acronym that stands for Not in Education, Employment, or Training. NEETs are often shut-ins who refuse to leave their rooms due to various reasons, most commonly social anxiety. Michio lives in a Japanese city that is currently being devastated by the Stitch murders. A series of murders where large groups of people turn up dead, all stitched to each other. The group behind the Stitch murders is known as the Army of One, and they actively advertise themselves through radio and flyers with ads declaring that no one likes someone who is lonely, and that everyone should become one. As time goes on, it's discovered that it is actually safer to stay on your own, as only large groups are targeted. It is later revealed that all the people killed actually sewed themselves together willingly, as the Army of One is actually some form of mimetic hazard or mass hysteria. I believe Junji Ito uses this story to subvert the typical conventions of NEETs and shut-ins in Japanese media. Since the Army of One only targets large groups of people, then it isn't really targeting people who are lonely at the moment. Perhaps this suggests that there is an ingrained sense of loneliness in Japanese society, and the Army of One only affects people who repress their true loneliness. Since people like Michio already recognize that they are lonely and have come to terms with that fact, they are unable to be affected by the Army of One. It's quite the interesting statement on loneliness in Japan, one that completely subverts any ideas I had on cultural loneliness beforehand. So, those were a few Junji Ito stories that I felt best critiqued Japanese society. Some of these I feel were a bit of a stretch, but they were still interesting theories to look into nonetheless. I feel this extra layer of meaning really adds to my appreciation of Junji Ito. On my first read, I enjoy the scares and body horror, but it's always great rereading his stories later and gaining extra meaning. Also, before I go, I would like to say that I am so happy that we have hit 1,000 subscribers. It really blows me away how far this channel has gone. I want to say thank you to each and every one of you who has subscribed. I read every single comment y'all leave, and I try to respond to as many as I can. It really does mean so much to me. Anyways, with that out of the way, this is CJ Max signing off. Have a nice tragedy.